Okay, so welcome to the third and final video of the skeletal muscle, or not skeletal muscle, but the muscle system chapter. Um, in this video, we're going to talk about contractions, kind of how the amount of neurons and nerves that are associated with a muscle can incite different forces, how multiple stimuli together can have a stronger force, and then we'll finish up with some diseases of the muscular system. So with muscles, you can have two type of contractions. You can have isotonic contractions where the muscles shorten, contract, and they cause movement. Or you can have isometric contractions where the muscles generate a force, but they don't shorten and no movement is caused. An isotonic contraction is pretty much any movement contraction. So like moving your elbows, walking, running, jumping, etc. An isometric contraction is, think about tightening up your abdominal muscles. You're generating a force, but there's no movement generated there. So if you just kind of tighten your muscles, you're generating that force, but not providing a source of movement. Now, the amount of force that we get during our muscle contractions depends on the nerve activation. And so whenever we talk about nerve activation, we're going to be referring to several different terms, and we're going to go over what these terms are before we start talking about how activation affects force. So we're going to mention motor unit, muscle tension, the all or none principle, muscle tone, and recruitment. So first, a motor unit is basically a motor neuron. So a neuron that is bringing information from the central nervous system to a target cell. In this case, it's a muscle cell. And so a motor neuron is, a motor unit is a motor neuron and all of the muscle cells that it's controlling and interacting with. So this is the smallest functional unit of a muscle contraction. So you have to have at least one motor unit in order for a muscle traction to happen. Okay? But you can get multiple motor units working together to create more force during a specific contraction. Now, muscle tension is the force that muscles generate when they contract. So this is determined by the motor unit size. So if the motor neuron is controlling a lot of muscle cells versus a small amount of muscle cells, then you're going to get higher force. So the more muscle cells you're controlling, the more force you get. And that's also related to the number of active motor units. So if you have only one motor unit active, your force is going to be smaller than if you had, say, like 4 motor units active. And then the final thing that determines tension is just the frequency of the stimulation, right? And we'll look at that in a little bit. But basically, if you have, a stimulation that causes a contraction, and then you wait, say, 10 seconds, and another stimulation that causes a contraction, those contractions never are overlapping. But if you have very quick stimuli, so very quick successions of stimulations, then you get overlapping contractions, and that can sum up to equal larger forces. And we'll again look at that in a few minutes. Now, a muscle contraction is known as an all or none principle. Your muscle can't halfway contract. It's either going to completely contract or it's going to be relaxed. So it's this all or none principle. It either happens or it doesn't happen. Okay. Now, muscle tone is related to hold muscles and the fact that they're maintaining kind of this intermediate level of force. And so this is what we refer to as muscle tone. And then the last term we want to be familiar with is recruitment. And so recruitment is just activating additional motor units to create more muscle tone. So here we have 2 motor neurons that are controlling these muscle cells, right? So this motor neuron controls these two muscle cells, and this motor neuron controls these three muscle cells, okay? And so we have basically kind of two motor units here, right? So a motor unit consists of the motor neuron and all the muscle cells. We have one motor unit with the two, one motor unit with the three. Now, if you look at a micrograph, right, you can see those neurons interacting with the skeletal muscle. You can see how it kind of branches to control all of the different muscle cells in that vicinity. Now with this all or none principle, you get a complete cycle of contraction and relaxation whenever you have a stimulus stimulating that contraction process. And what we can do is we can actually observe the relaxation and contraction periods of a muscle by using a myogram. And so we're just using a machine to look at the muscle activity. And the muscle activity can be summarized based off of these 5 different kind of terms. So you have a latent period where this kind of a lag period that happens after a stimulus. Then you have contraction, which is the actual contraction period, the relaxation period where the muscle relaxes. Then you can have summation, and you can have tectonic contraction. Okay, and so here is an image of, say, information from a myogram. So here you have your stimulus, you have your latent period, right? So all of the inner workings are happening. So that electrical signals being sent to the muscle, your calcium ions are being released, they're binding to the troponin and the tropomyosin complex. And then once the cross bridges finally happen, then you get your contraction, right? Which is this peak area here. So that's the muscle force. So the muscle force increases due to that contraction. Then your muscle force decreases once the relaxation happens. And then it's just waiting for another stimulus. And so everywhere there's an arrow is a stimulus that occurs, right? So here we have 2 stimuli back to back, and they kind of lead to a slightly larger, not much, about this much difference in terms of muscle force. But before the muscles can completely relax, boom, another stimulus happens. And so the muscles contract again. And so that increases the force. But then we have all of these stimuli kind of happening right after another, which is not letting those muscles contract. And so it's increasing the force that exists in these muscles. This process is called summation. Okay? Whereas if this was one contraction alone, you would generally only get a force, about this much if we drew it across. But because you have that multiple stimuli over and over again, without allowing that muscle cell to completely relax, you get an increased force, right? Now, if the muscle is contracting fast enough to where it's under a constant state of contraction, that's referred to as tetanus. Okay? And that can be painful. It can make you feel weak because you're just using a lot of energy as that tetanus state happens. Now, within our muscles, we can have different types of muscle fibers. These are known as slow twitch and fast twitch muscle fibers. You've probably also heard of them being referred to as red muscle and white muscle. Basically, your slow twitch fibers, they contract slowly And the muscles are really good for endurance activities. So if you're a marathon runner, you've probably been training for that marathon, and so you're increasing the capability of your slow twitch fibers. Now, if you are a sprinter, you have been training your fast twitch fibers, right? And so the names come from how fast they contract. So slow twitch is slow, fast twitch is fast contractions. Now, fast twitch rapidly breaks down your ATP stores, and because that activity is just happening so quickly, it just depletes the ATP stores, and then once the activity's over, it builds those ATP stores back up. But because of that, it's not undergoing like cellular respiration and generating ATP during the activity, so it doesn't need a lot of mitochondria, not a lot of blood vessels, because it doesn't need that oxygen, as much oxygen, to keep that constant ATP store there, and it tends to store a lot of glycogen molecules. Okay? And these are capable of anaerobic metabolism. So after you use that initial amount of oxygen and ATP, it then can break down those glucose molecules to get, say, 2 ATP, for every cycle during that anaerobic metabolism. Now, slow twitch fibers are basically the exact opposite. Contract slowly. They make the ATP as they need it due to cellular respiration, aerobic metabolism. And because of that, they need a lot of mitochondria to generate that ATP. And so you also need a lot of blood to bring in that oxygen and to get rid of the carbon dioxide that's made through that cellular respiration process. Because of this, they don't have a lot of glycogen because they're using that glycogen and taking that those glucose molecules off and using it relatively, that's what they're using to break down and make that ATP. And so you have your endurance muscle fibers and your kind of sprinting muscle fibers. If any of you are fishermen or fisherwomen, and you've caught, say like a shark, or if you've ever seen shark tissue, you notice that their tissue is white. And if you think about how a shark hunts, it has this burst of speed, and they just kind of burst and attack their prey. So they have a lot of white muscle, a lot of fast twitch muscle fibers. Whereas if you've seen like tuna, they have a lot of red muscle, and so they're really good for long distance swimming, kind of endurance based swimming. And so fish are usually like a really good example for showing this, because a lot of us are more familiar with the coloration of that tissue, and we know the activities of those fish. So that's just kind of one way to think about fast versus slow twitch fibers. Now, with our muscles, we can improve muscle mass, we can improve the strength and force of those muscles, and we can improve the endurance by different types of training. So if you want to get more myofibrils, get faster twitch fibers, you're going to do short, intense strength training workouts, resistance training to build up those fast twitch fibers. But if you want more of, say, a marathon type endurance, you're going to do more of an aerobic training where you're increasing the blood supply to the muscles, you're increasing the mitochondria and the amount of myoglobin that you have in your muscles, you're building up that endurance. And usually, instead of short, intense workouts, the person who's exercising is going to target to increase their heart rate up to their maximum heart rate, target heart rate, not maximum, but the target heart rate for their exercise. And they want to hold that for at least 20 minutes during that exercise. And they're going to do that about three or so times a week to help build up their red muscle cells. Now, moving from skeletal muscles to your cardiac and smooth muscles, we're not going to go into as much detail with these. We're just going to kind of talk about the different structural components of each and their uses, and then we'll finish up with our diseases. For cardiac and smooth muscles, they have some different features compared to skeletal muscles, right? First, foremost, they're involuntary. We don't control those contractions. So they contract entirely on their own in the absence of nerve stimulation, right? So they're working constantly. Cardiac muscles are actually joined together by what's known as intercalated disc. And these discs have gap junctions, which we referred to in our earlier chapter, that allow electrical signals to move between those cells and to communicate with one another. Smooth muscles are also joined by gap junctions, which again allows for communication. And so the cardiac and smooth muscles are responding to the ANS, so stimuli from the autonomic nervous system. And we'll talk all about that when we talk about the nervous system itself. And that ANS can actually modify the degree of contraction and the rate of contractions for those different muscles. So here we have cardiac muscle tissue, so a micrograph of that. You can see these little lines, that's the intercalated disc. If you look at kind of an artist representation, these little lines here are the intercalated disc, right, that are separating that. So this is basically one muscle cell. You zoom into those intercalated discs, this is kind of what they look like. They have those protein channels. But then also notice there's adhesion junctions. Remember, adhesion junctions is for flexibility, for when those muscles contract. And so because of the structure of cardiac muscles and the fact that their sarcomere arrangements are in thick and thin filaments, and the orientation is really kind of similar to skeletal muscles, cardiac muscle also has a striated appearance. But smooth muscles, they don't have any striations. And this is because instead of the filaments being arranged in these kind of layered bundles, the smooth muscles the filaments are arranged in these kind of crisscross bundles. And so not in these sarcomere arrangements. And this image really kind of shows that. So you have your smooth muscle here in a relaxed state. And these are the thick and thin filaments, right? And so if we zoom in to kind of one section, you can see the myosin and you can see the actin. So it's set up exactly the same way as skeletal muscles and cardiac muscles, but the orientation's different. So it doesn't give that striated appearance. And then whenever you contract, it's basically like pulling a drawstring on a net around, your clothes or something, and it's causing that muscle to constrict and tighten. I don't know why, but this always makes me think of like a roast in the grocery store that has that netting around it to hold it together. And so that's kind of how I always remember what the filament bundles look like in smooth muscles. And so here's a micrograph of several different smooth muscles, muscle cells. And you can see there's no real striation pattern to this. Now, if we look at the speed of contraction and how constant those type of muscles can keep up that contraction in terms of fatigue, skeletal muscles are the fastest contraction. Smooth muscles are the slowest, with cardiac muscles in between. Skeletal muscles can fatigue. Smooth muscles pretty much never fatigue. Okay. Cardiac muscles can fatigue, but generally they are pretty active and don't really tire out. So the likelihood of fatigue in cardiac muscles is pretty low because they have that relaxation between contractions, right? So like your heart pumps, right? So it will contract, relax, contract, relax, contract, relax. And so that reduces the likelihood of fatigue. But now if you have like a disease or strain on your heart, you can get fatigue in your heart muscles, your cardiac muscles. And so this just kind of summarizes everything we've talked about throughout this chapter. And so you'd want to become familiar with this table. It's just a good study table to look at whenever you study for this chapter on your or for your second exam. Now, just to kind of briefly mention some diseases and disorders of the muscular system. First is muscular dystrophy, which is a genetic-based disease. This is basically where you have a protein that is modified that allows calcium to continually leak into the cells. That extra calcium destroys muscle proteins, which leads to kind of a weakening and wasting away of the muscles. And then over time, those the muscle mass, the muscle fibers are replaced with connective tissue. And so you can have a big issue with losing kind of movement mobility with the wasting and weakening of the muscles. Generally, life expectancy with this type of disease is about 30 years. Depending on treatment and severity, that can vary. Another disease is tetanus. So this is an infection by bacteria. The species is Clostridium tetani. Sorry, my nose will get you. And that species of bacteria produces a toxin which causes your muscles to forcefully contract. And that continuous contraction can actually cause respiratory failure. And if your respiratory system fails, then that can lead to death. You can get your tetanus shot, your tetanus vaccine, that can prevent the bacteria from being able to come in and produce that toxin, right? So like you get your tetanus shot updated, or if you step on like an object that was outside or rusty, there's a chance that that bacteria was on it. So you would go get a tetanus shot to reduce to not allow that bacteria to get hold and to produce that toxin. And then just some kind of general diseases and disorders. You have muscle cramps, which is usually due to dehydration, not enough water, not enough ions to allow for all of the processes to happen that goes on in muscles. And so you can get cramps resulting from that. Pulled muscles is where you just overstretch your muscle fibers and those fibers tear apart. So they would have to heal and basically heal themselves over time. Depending on how severe it is, you may need surgery. And then fasciitis is fascia. So, the fascia bundles that surround the muscle fibers, that fascia, that connective tissue can become inflamed. And if that inflammation happens, that's fasciitis. A really common one known as plantar fasciitis. So plantar is associated with the foot. And so that's just the fascicles that are in or the fascia that's in the foot become inflamed and can be really painful and can lead to fasciitis in that way. Okay, and so that's it for our muscle system chapter. And that's it for the information for this module. And so as always, let me know if you have any questions, if you have any concerns, and we'll see you in the next module.